When it came to combat operations off of Guadalcanal, the American cruiser force suffered heavily. Nowhere else saw so many of these ships sent to the bottom in such a short time frame. From Quincy and her sisters to Atlanta and Juneau, these ships were pounded into the bottom by the Japanese. However, not all of the American cruisers suffered in that way. USS Helena was a notable exception, not only in escaping major damage, but in just how much damage she did to the Japanese in turn. When you're being called the machine gun cruiser, well, you're doing something right. It's unfortunate that for all of her good fortune off Guadalcanal, Helena would be one of the final American cruisers lost to enemy action. Before all of that, though, it is tradition that I cover her design details and construction. Helena was laid down on December 9, 1936, as the last of the Brooklyn-class cruisers. These were the most modern American cruisers going into the Second World War. However, Helena and her sister St. Louis are fairly different from the rest of the class. Not quite enough to be considered a fully separate class by most sources, but at minimum a subclass. There were several changes to the design to justify that classification in this case. I'll cover that in more detail when I get around to St. Louis, but the Cliff Notes version here. On the interior, St. Louis and Helena had their machinery spaces modified. Higher pressure boilers were installed, in addition to the changes to the machinery spaces themselves. Those consisted of a new system of alternating boiler and engine rooms. In previous American designs, ships would have had all the boiler rooms ahead of the engine spaces. Good way to save space and weight, not so good for survivability of the power plant. As such, on these two cruisers, they shifted to alternating blocks for the engine rooms and boiler rooms. This would, in theory, allow the ship to retain power in the event a single boiler or engine room was flooded. Past that, the most clearly visible change was a shift in secondary battery. The older Brooklyns had used single-mounted 5-inch 25 caliber guns. St. Louis and Helena had, instead, 4 twin mounts for the newer and superior 5-inch 38 caliber gun. These are quite easy to see and are the best way to know you're looking at one of these two ships, barring being able to see the hull number. Beyond these changes, however, Helena was broadly similar to her earlier sister ships. She carried the same main battery of 15 6-inch guns. These were mounted in 5 triple turrets, with a pair superfiring on the bow and another pair superfiring on the stern. The final 6-inch turret was mounted just ahead of the bridge and right behind the forward superfiring pair. Supporting these were the aforementioned 5-inch guns, 8 in all, in 4 twin mounts. These were fitted 2 to a side, with the forward pair on either side of the bridge, and the aft pair on either side of the superstructure behind the funnels. What she most assuredly did not carry, however, were torpedo tubes. By this point, with the exception of the Atlantas and Omahas, American cruisers no longer carried such weapons. Helena's only weapons were her cannon, which she would put to good use. To help guide those guns, Helena also carried 4 scout aircraft on her stern. That aside, to round out her technical details, the cruiser displaced just over 10,000 tons on her standard load, and 13,500 on full load. This allowed her to carry the weaponry I went over already, in addition to an armor belt of 3 to 5 inches, 83 to 127 millimeters in thickness. Her fancy new boilers, meanwhile, provided 100,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. With that power, Helena could reach around 32.5 knots. Fairly average for an American cruiser in that regard. That rounds out the relevant details for this video, so let's move on to service history at this point. First off, Helena was launched on August 28, 1938, from the New York Naval Shipyard. Her commissioning would follow on September 18, 1939, not long after the war in Europe began. With the United States neutral, if heavily in favor of the Allies, Helena went about her sea trials in a normal way, at first. The normal sailing around in American waters, working up her crew and figuring out any technical defects that might need fixing. However, shortly after she formally entered service, Helena set off for South America in December 1939. This isn't terribly unusual in its own right. The Navy would often send ships down to South America to make various port calls. Where things are different with Helena, then, is in one of those port visits. On January 29, 1940, the cruiser arrived at Montevideo. This is relevant because, unlike most South American ports, it had recently seen a battle off the coast. That battle was the engagement between Graf Spee and the British cruiser force. The battle that had forced the German raider to take shelter in Montevideo before sailing out to be scuttled instead of interned. This was done in shallow enough water that the crew of Helena was able to climb aboard and examine the remains of the Panzerschiff. This was certainly not an average shakedown duty by any stretch of the imagination. While the Germans had done a pretty good job of destroying most valuable things on the ship, there was still enough left to get some good information on her. Certainly, most of the pictures we have of Spee's wreck came from Helena's crew. It was a nice intelligence gathering opportunity, if nothing else. That said, Helena was underway and heading back home by mid-February 1940. The standard dry dock work followed from March to July. However, unlike the visit to Graf Spee, nothing much would happen for the remainder of her time in the Atlantic. Training and further sea trials were about the extent of it before Helena was sent off to the Pacific Ocean and Pacific Fleet. This was in September, with the cruiser arriving in Pearl Harbor to join the rest of the fleet in late October. In common with the rest of the Pacific Fleet, yet more training duty would follow for the next year. The biggest break in this process was a refit from July to September 1941 that, among other things, saw her anti-aircraft battery enhanced by the fitting of 1.1-inch cannon. Though those were, of course, not the best weapon. Better than machine guns for this particular job, but that's not saying much. Other than that, though, nothing major would happen until Helena found herself in Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The cruiser was moored alongside the antique mine layer Oglala, awaiting another routine refit period. The pair were moored where USS Pennsylvania would otherwise have been located. Since that battleship was in dry dock, her berth had been freed up. When the Japanese attacked then, one could argue they hit Helena because she was in Pennsylvania's place. In any event, on December 7th, the Japanese launched their infamous attack on Pearl Harbor. Within a few minutes of the attack beginning, Helena was hit by a single torpedo. This weapon had gone right beneath Oglala, running too deep to hit the mine layer, and it then slammed into Helena amidships on her starboard side. While it didn't matter as much because she was in dock, her modified machinery spaces came in handy here. One engine room and one boiler room were flooded, while an older cruiser might well have suffered worse damage. In spite of this damage, Helena's crew was quick to set about fixing things. The wiring to her main battery and 5-inch guns was severed, but it didn't stop her crew. They were able to get her forward diesel generator up and running in a couple minutes. This restored auxiliary power to the mounts, allowing the cruiser's crew to put up a withering weight of fire. Although the rewiring and rerouting of power did cause at least 4 electrical fires, which goes to show how much of a hack job the crew had to perform to keep the guns running. With her weaponry firing, though, and the Japanese probably realizing they weren't attacking a battleship, they broke off major attacks. There's some evidence other torpedoes were sent her way, but none hit. One does seem to have hit a transporter station ashore, however. During the second wave, then, the cruiser continued to defend herself and nearby ships. Her fire was credited with shooting down 6 Japanese planes, of the 29 lost in the attack. Helena, herself, avoided any other major damage. There were several near misses from bombs, with one hitting the pier next to the cruiser, and the other 3 landing in the water nearby. Over the course of this, the cruiser fired off no fewer than 375 rounds from her 5-inch guns, alongside 3,000 rounds from her 1.1-inch guns, and 5,000 from her machine guns. Unfortunately, while Helena escaped major damage as a result of her defensive fire, Oglala was not so fortunate. The explosive concussion from the initial torpedo hit, and the bomb near misses for that matter, had ruptured her hull. The mine layer eventually capsized after being towed free, while Helena continued to fight back. When the attack came to an end, Helena was moved to dry dock for initial repairs. The torpedo damage was welded over by December 31st, and Helena sailed off for the west coast on January 5th, 1942. By the end of the month, she was in dry dock for refit and proper repairs. This would last until the 4th of July for the initial repairs. After sea trials, she returned to port and was fitted with new radar and improved anti-aircraft guns, including the far superior 40mm Bofors gun. By the end of July, Helena was back in service, in more or less the configuration she would remain in for the rest of the war. The cruiser was sent off to rejoin the conflict, specifically the mess that was the Guadalcanal campaign. It was here that Helena would make a name for herself, as if her actions at Pearl Harbor were only an appetizer to what this ship and this crew was capable of. Which is saying something, considering what she did in Pearl Harbor. That said, at first, Helena was mostly preoccupied with escort duty. She joined up with USS Wasp and escorted convoys to Guadalcanal. This would keep the ship occupied for a while, until September of 1942. It was during this month, on September 15th, that the war came back to Helena in a big way. Specifically, when Wasp was torpedoed and sent to the bottom. Helena immediately set about helping the stricken carrier, eventually taking on 400 of Wasp's crew. The cruiser carried these men to safety ashore before returning to the meat grinder off of Guadalcanal. This would lead her into her first major surface action, the Battle of Cape Esperance. This came on the night of October 11th. While by no means the chaotic mess that was the Battle of Savo Island, this battle would still follow the theme of night operations off Guadalcanal. Ships blasting away into the darkness at point-blank range, pounding each other with everything from 5-inch to 8-inch shells. It's certainly worth a video on its own merits, so for now I'll mostly focus on our current ship and her actions. Helena, under the command of Captain Gilbert Hoover, put her fancy new radar to good use in this battle. That said, as I get into this action, keep in mind that Helena was towards the rear of the American formation. The cruiser and the similarly equipped USS Boise were both behind other American cruisers. While the other ships carried radar sets, they were an older and less effective model. Even with this potential handicap, Helena was quick to pick out the oncoming Japanese ships around 11:30 that night. While warily watching the oncoming contacts, Helena joined the American formation in reversing course, conveniently into a perfect position to cross the Japanese formation's T. That is, for those unfamiliar with the term, sailing in a line that allowed the American ships to fire all their guns on their broadside, while the Japanese, meanwhile, were sailing in a line that only allowed for using their bow weapons. The map on screen is a good visual indicator of what I mean. However, while this was a perfect chance to hammer the Japanese, no order to open fire was forthcoming. Admiral Scott was, as he would later claim, too concerned about American destroyers that had botched the turn to risk opening fire. In fairness to him, his caution was warranted insofar as his flagship had no easy way to spot the destroyers. Nonetheless, Hoover was not inclined to wait. He watched the Japanese draw closer and closer on the radar until a lookout aboard Helena reported the ships were visible. Even in the darkness of that night, the Japanese were close enough to be seen by the naked eye. With the crew openly wondering why they hadn't opened fire, Hoover contacted Scott aboard USS San Francisco. By this point, the Japanese formation was only about 5,000 yards away. Hoover, receiving a Roger in response, took that as permission to open fire. He even repeated the request and got the same response back. For his part, Scott thought that he was just acknowledging Helena's reported radar contact. Captain Hoover took the response and ran with it, regardless of if he really believed it was permission to fire. Certainly it could be read as such under standard communication rules. Regardless, Helena opened fire on the Japanese with everything she had. The cruiser was soon joined by the rest of the formation, up to and including San Francisco herself. The Japanese, otherwise masters of night fighting, were caught completely off guard. Under the command of Aritomo Goto, they lacked radar and had not spotted the American ships visually either. So one can imagine the surprise on the Japanese ships when they were suddenly deluged in 6 and 8-inch shells. The following action was a confusing mess, though the Japanese were quickly left without a commander, as Goto was mortally wounded and his flagship was hammered. While Scott ordered the ships to stop firing out of fear for the destroyers, they mostly kept on shooting. Helena, in particular, shot so fast that Hoover could barely keep track of it. Both American and Japanese ships reported the light cruisers as firing so fast it looked like machine gun fire. It is here where Helena began to earn the reputation as the machine gun cruiser. Her crew fired so fast that salvo fire was impossible, as every gun fired as soon as it was able. By the end of that battle, the Japanese had lost an admiral, a heavy cruiser, and a destroyer. Another heavy cruiser was also heavily damaged. It was a rousing success for the Americans, even with the loss of a destroyer and damage to other ships, something that the Navy needed after the disaster of Salvo Island. Helena had contributed much to that victory and earned herself a reputation for fast and accurate gunfire. Following that battle, though, Helena returned to quieter duties. She joined up with the newly arrived USS Washington and served on escort duty. This would see the ship avoid a Japanese submarine on October 20th. A few days later, as the Battle of Santa Cruz saw the death of USS Hornet, Helena was left alone, along with the rest of her formation for that matter. The next time her guns were used in anger, it was directed at Japanese forces ashore on Guadalcanal. On November 4th, she fired in support of the Marines on the island. This was still fairly quiet duty, as these things go, and nothing particularly exciting. That would come in mid-November, during the series of engagements that made up the greater naval Battle of Guadalcanal, or 3rd and 4th Salvo Island, depending on what source you use. Helena's role came in the first of these battles. Once more under the command of an admiral who didn't quite grasp the utility of her radar, Helena was near the end of the American formation. And, once again, her more modern radar spotted the enemy fairly early. This time, however, Hoover did not get the chance to open fire first. This battle was, if anything, even more of a chaotic affair than her previous one. Both American and Japanese formations barreled right into one another. Destroyers engaged each other first, alongside the USS Atlanta blasting away at the unfortunate Japanese destroyer Akatsuki. What began as chaos only got worse. The formations intermingled with one another, with multiple cases of near collisions. USS Laffey pulled the naval equivalent of "bring me closer, I want to hit him with my sword" by raking Hiei's superstructure at point-blank range. Atlanta was blasted by torpedoes from the Japanese and 8-inch gunfire from San Francisco, and Helena, firing her guns in every direction, spent the battle shooting at anything that moved. She helped sink Akatsuki. Her guns battered several other Japanese destroyers. Her anti-aircraft battery fired on the cruiser Nagara. Throughout this barroom brawl in the high seas, Helena's helmsman earned his keep. The cruiser sailed between blazing hulks, firing on any Japanese ships she could see. Her fire would heavily damage several Japanese ships, while the rest of the American formation took a heavy pounding in their own right. Except for Helena, who came out with barely any damage. This battle was about as close to hell on earth as any naval engagement, but Helena escaped any real damage. It must have been quite a shock as the smoke cleared to realize that. As, I'm sure, it was for Hoover to realize he was now the ranking officer in the battered American formation. He was prompt to gather the wounded American ships to Helena and began to shepherd them out of the battle zone. Or at least as many as he could manage. Others, such as Atlanta and Portland, did not join the group. Or could not join the group, for that matter. In any event, up to this point, Hoover had been nothing but an exemplary combat captain, if you ignore the creative interpretation of Scott's orders at Cape Esperance. Unfortunately, it was here that his star lost its luster. As Helena escorted her herd of cripples out of the area, the Japanese submarine I-26 lurked beneath the waves. She fired a spread of torpedoes at the limping San Francisco. These would miss their intended target, but one of the torpedoes hit USS Juneau, almost exactly where she had already suffered a hit from a destroyer Longlance in the earlier battle. Juneau promptly blew apart in a massive explosion, sinking within 30 seconds. The story of Juneau's survivors deserves its own video, as does the story of Captain Hoover's actions. Suffice it to say that the following events were incredibly controversial, even at the time. Hoover was removed by Admiral Halsey for not doing more to rescue the survivors, and that was the end of his time aboard Helena. And so it was that Helena lost her most successful captain. Now, with a new commander, Helena returned to battle. Starting in January 1943, she mostly relegated herself to shore bombardment duty. This was quiet service, such as it was, and other than air attack, there was little real excitement. Even that was less dangerous than it would have been before, as Helena received the new VT fuses for her 5-inch guns. The next bit of real excitement was, once again, delivered by means of submarine. This time the submarine I-18 attempted to torpedo Helena on February 11, 1943, and missed. At which point Fletcher and O'Bannon promptly engaged and sank the submarine with help from Helena's scout aircraft. Helena would then go in for refit in Australia, staying there until late March. After returning to the Solomons, it was back to shore bombardment. While ships around her would get up to varying degrees of action, Helena's guns would largely be reserved for pounding targets ashore. Until, that is, the Battle of Kula Gulf. On July 6, 1943, Helena was sailing with her sisters Honolulu and St. Louis, as well as 4 destroyers, including her old friend O'Bannon. They were attempting to engage a Japanese Tokyo Express supply run, which in this case amounted to 10 destroyers. Over the course of this battle, Helena, and the other American ships, succeeded in sinking 2 of the Japanese destroyers. However, Helena had been forced to dip into her normal shell stock after running out of flashless shells. This created some truly awe-inspiring images of her blasting away, but it also opened herself to the Japanese. They had a target to aim for, and made deadly use of it. At around 2 a.m., one long lance slammed into Helena's bow. This destroyed her foremost turret, and the motion of the ship wrenched her damaged bow clean off. This was possibly survivable damage, as American cruisers had a habit of surviving their bows being blown off. The cruiser could even manage 25 knots at first. However, Helena would be struck 2 more times in short order, both of which were right amidships. And those were the fatal blows. They broke her keel, flooded her machinery spaces, and crippled the cruiser. The flooding quickly became too much for the crew to handle, and orders went out to abandon ship. Helena sank quickly as her hull buckled and her stern broke off. Her men were left floating in the water along with the bow, stubbornly remaining afloat. Rescue operations would commence and be interrupted 3 times by Japanese destroyers searching for one of their own ships. USS Nicholas and USS Radford picked up 735 survivors between them. The remaining survivors would end up on various islands after clinging to the bow or climbing aboard various boats and rafts. In the end, in spite of her violent sinking, only 168 men would be lost with Helena or after she sank, out of a crew of almost 1,200. Right to the end, Helena kept her crew safe, and that's the best anyone can ask of any ship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.